But I mean, that's a huge problem, and it's not something that people talk about very much. Is this difficulty just having adult men around the kids, especially in younger kids when they're in school, and especially with so many young
Mm.
boys who don't have a father around.
Hello and welcome to Shared.Care's What is Manly radio show and podcast. Men feel more lonely, lost, and not useful in society than ever in history. Males are not attaching to school, work, or women. What it means to be a man appears lost. Is there a framework for being manly that we can unearth?
Welcome to Share.Care, an all-inclusive community sharing experience, strength, and hope to create strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships. Share.Care communities work toward every individual feeling safe, valued, and heard, free from the threat of danger, pain, or harm. Each episode, founder Damian Andrews explores the principles underpinning Share.Care and invites expert special guests to share their knowledge so you can easily reap the benefits so many others experience. You hold the choice to create your future. Let it be with strong, healthy, and inspiring relationships.
Hello, JP. How are you today?
I'm doing very well. Thank you for having me, and greetings from California.
Yeah, it's wonderful. COVID was pretty terrible, but it did create this opportunity where, as much as we've had this technology for a long time, people said, oh, we can actually use this. And not only that, for business, they went, it's cheaper to have meetings this way.
Exactly. It's kind of like it's forced a much larger um, portion of the society to just accept that a lot of things are possible.
Yeah, and that's really true. I love that. And being able to connect with so many different people, because unless you have the ability to travel around the world, and you've done a fair bit of travel and worked in a number of different places, but a lot of people may not have that opportunity, and they don't get to see the diversity of culture that's out there, diversity of people, and also how much we are similar as well.
Yeah, I agree. And I think now that you have a lot of older people, for example, who are not considered, say, early adopters of technology, and now they're just doing FaceTime with the grandkids or friends, or
Mm.
even with this book. There are so many. I started a book club with a friend, coworker recently, and then I also went and visited a book club who had read my book. And it's kind of nice because when I tell people, "Oh, I started a book club," there's the question of, is it online? Is it on Zoom? Or is it in person? Are you all together physically? And I think prior to COVID, that question would never have even been asked. The assumption would be that we all meet at someone's house on a Tuesday or something like that. So
Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
I'm very excited about that.
Yeah, and it's quite amazing how you can do that. I mean, there's so many people I connect with that I never would have had that opportunity without people adopting that process that you're talking about. And you can do the combination as well. You can have in person and virtual together, which is really exciting.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things we do at work is training. I do instructional design, but I work with a lot of the teachers who are in the classroom, and it is a big challenge. I mean, what we've also found is that if you can choose one and not have the hybrid,
Mm.
if you can either do a Zoom class or have everybody show up in the class, it's good. And we've also had um, success with what we call a producer. So somebody is there who's just kind of a fly on the wall watching the training happen
Mm.
and then helping with any kind of tech support. Or if you have like 30 people in a classroom and something goes wrong, you don't want the whole class and the curriculum to come to a screeching halt
Yeah.
to help somebody get back online. So it's always nice to have somebody just to help out with that kind of thing. So
Yeah, it's
it's
wonderful.
definitely a new territory for all of us.
Yeah, and it's one of those learning processes we go through. But as you mentioned before, we've learnt that we can actually, adopt this kind of thing, and it's interesting that we learn what we're capable of.
Hmm.
But for the audience, who we have JP Lane. He has a diverse history of work in a variety of different fields, including e-learning, workshop creation, call centers, pharmaceutical. There's a long list there, and he's also worked in places like the Philippines, Japan, and Latin America. So he brings this wonderful, diverse background and history to his knowledge base. Plus, on top of that, he's has a strong history or strong experience in arts. He's been a painter for 20 years, I think you mentioned in the pre-show.
Mm-hmm.
And also, as you can see, for those watching, he's got a book as well, the Driftwood Tour, and he's become a writer as well. So very diverse background, and I think that relates very much, and you draw a lot of experience for the topic that we're talking about is what is manly, because men today, from a lot of reports out there's a lot of men that are feeling lost, they're feeling lonely, that they don't have a place in society. And, I mean, when you look at it, there's men that, only 40% of men are completing higher education. They're not engaging with women. I'm kind of lost by that one. What have you seen, if we start more broadly, what have you noticed is happening in your area of the world?
Yeah, it's a big question, and I have my son is 21 and my daughter is 18, and we were just this topic keeps coming up over and over again. I was just having breakfast with some friends this morning, and they have kids who are around the same age, and we just noticed that um, this generation right now, they don't seem to want to really jump out of their comfort zone. An easy example is just getting their driver's license, which here in the U.S. you have to be 16, and maybe that's because I was from I was from a very small town. It was pretty boring. There wasn't a lot to do, and as soon as you could get your driver's license, that meant that you had freedom, that you didn't
Mm,
have to ask mom and dad to take you somewhere. I think maybe the internet is a big, or particularly cell phones, because I
mm.
can be entertained so much just sitting on the sofa. And so there's so
That's a
many
good
things that I
point.
can do as an adult. I also think sometimes we lay all of this at the feet of teenagers when we're doing the exact same thing, right? Somebody could be 70 years old and they're playing video games on their game as well, or on their phone as well. So I think there's just this lack of a strong desire to get out there and be uncomfortable doing things.
Mm,
And I've noticed with um, well, like my son and his friends, I would ask him like, well, how, just tell me how many of your friends, and I know these guys, I don't need to know names. I'm not going to tell their parents or whatever, but who who's gone to a party? Who's dating? How many of your friends are still virgins? Who has their driver's license?
mm,
Who's doing all of these and some of them are good and some of them are bad, but I mean,
mm.
who is kind of entering into adulthood?
Yeah.
And um and it turns out, it's okay. He put himself out there and he's seeing someone now,
Mm,
and that's, very exciting, right? But I think yeah, I think there are a lot of reasons why, and maybe COVID has something to do with it as well, that people
mm,
are, I think there's a lot of things. There's the internet, there's COVID has created a fear in some people. I
mm,
think maybe I do see a kind of a duality of the results of, I guess, what we would call cancel culture, that people are kind of hyper vigilant about the things that they're saying online.
mm.
And yet I think a lot of younger kids are much more conscious that if they just start to say something that's like racist or whatever, that's going to be called out, that there will be some accountability for that. um, Even if that accountability might be, an overreaction, and we have total strangers, tearing us down, right? But I do think that younger kids, they kind of see that, and they're a little more conscious about what they're
Yeah.
saying to each other and how the words that they use could be perceived.
It's an interesting point. I mean, we come back to this stepping out there and that responsibility of, as you said, you can be so entertained on the sofa. I relate to that. On my actual 18th birthday, you get your full license at 18 in Australia, and I
Mm,
had my driver's license booked on my birthday. I was getting it on that day. It was just, I wanted to be able to go out and do stuff, and similar sort of thing. I grew up in a small country town, and to be able to get around, it really, there was a bus, but that's not fun.
Right. It's not taking you to the places you would want to go.
No, exactly, and that's why there's that point too.
Right.
And certainly for me, it was like, because girls were a big part of my attraction at that age.
Sure.
I don't think there would have been many girls that were interested in going on a date via the bus. So, can you be ready here? And we'll walk to the bus stop, and then
Right.
So it was a big motivator. But from that cancel culture perspective, and is it a case where because if you have a conversation and say something respectfully or ask a question respectfully, that seems to stimulate conversation with the right kind of people. Is that part of the education that's missing? Because you can talk about topics that are highly controversial if you're if you are asking in a genuine way.
I think in any kind of difficult conversation with people, that may be like a coworker or somebody like that, or maybe you're having some kind of conflict with a neighbor or a family member, that just asking questions can be a much more beneficial way to handle it, because you're not just in somebody's face, you're asking them, and you're also giving them a chance to explain things. But the thing that I try to convey to my son and daughter is that, and maybe because of their age, they don't understand this, but everything that you're saying right now is potentially offensive to somebody 20 years from now. And that's the kind of a maddening thing, is literally the things that we're saying right now. You can't predict the future. We don't have a crystal ball. And even with the best of intentions, any label, just the vocabulary we use right now could be taken in the wrong way, right? So one of the examples that I gave was, so my daughter graduates from high school. Her last day was a few days ago, and then the actual graduation is tomorrow. And their high school mascot is the Matadors from Spain.
Yeah.
And they came up with it in the 60s. And you go to the campus, and there's these paintings of a guy holding a sword, and in Spanish, matar means to kill. So the literal meaning of a matador is a killer.
Yeah.
So, and I'm telling my kids and their friends, none of you are really awake to this, but it is entirely plausible that 20 years from now, you'll go back to somebody at the classroom or at the high school. You'll go to some alumni reunion, and not only has the mascot been changed, but the questions will be, I can't believe you went here. You came to this school and you didn't do jack shit.
I'm surprised you're not even getting that at the moment.
Right. Show me the petition you signed.
Yeah.
Saying that you don't want. It's not only somebody who kills, but it's somebody who kills a bull, who's killing an animal.
Yeah.
Right. And this is
helpless being.
Exactly. And I'm not trying to get on their case, but that is essentially what happens, I think, with cancel culture, is that there are things that are happening that we are, in a way, they're part of our lives and we are conscious of them, but we're not really paying attention to that. Right. We're paying attention to other things. And then at some point in the future, somebody says, well, I can't believe you didn't do anything about that. Right.
Have we got too serious and getting into too much nitty-gritty with that? Using that example, I mean, that was part of the Spanish culture and still is, as far as I'm aware.
It still is.
Yeah. So, and, from that perspective, just because we don't agree with it, I mean, you take that a step further, you go, well, everyone eating meat's killing some animal. Well, I mean, not actually killing it yourself, maybe, but, the animal was killed.
You're taking part in.
Yeah.
You're taking part in that system. Right. there are a lot of things. I mean, I'm driving my car around. I don't have an electric car.
Mm.
This is another good example. I know that, or I believe that there is climate change, that there is global warming, and
Mm.
I know that in my little way, by driving my car to the store and back, I'm contributing to global warming. I am. That's the deal.
Yeah.
Uh, but
That's a practical thing too, because we're dealing with that here in Australia as well.
mhm,
And when you look at that, the analogy I use is, most people have seen or know of Star Trek, and they have these matter transfer things where you press a button and you can beam in a glass of water or whatever,
yeah,
food, your dinner. And what's happened here is for the past 15 years, there hasn't been any allowance for development of the existing energy generation, because you couldn't talk about it, but it's been banned anyway. That well, not banned, but they haven't allowed for any way of improving the efficiency of the coal-fired power stations, for example.
okay,
Um, and so no one's invested in that or looked at ways of making them in a way where they don't emit greenhouse gases. And we know carbon capture does work. It just hasn't been developed to where it could have been developed.
mm,
And then on the same token, you've got, well, okay, the renewable side of things, but the reality is, from a renewable perspective, to have the build out that they want, if you take it from a global perspective, the resources don't exist on the planet to start with.
mm,
The
mhm,
quantity of resources needed to do that build out, and that's where I'm coming back to that whole point about when we're looking at being manly and how men now, you can look at just a look at the wrong way, particularly at a man, will shut him down. And do
mm.
we need to be encouraging, one, creating some safe spaces where people can have these conversations, go, well, let's have a think about this, let's have a discussion, but also encouraging men to approach things in a way where they stand up and say, hey, I've got some questions here. Do we need to be encouraging that?
I think so, and I think people need to be allowed to be wrong, right?
Mm.
People need to say, "Look, this is what I thought, and this I made an educated guess because that's what life is about." I mean,
Yes.
parenting is about making these educated guesses, and you have parents all the time who they're speaking to an adult child and thinking like, "Oh, well, this is what we thought was the right decision at the time."
Mm.
So I think people, yeah, they do need to be able to fail, and I think that, for example, companies that are on the cutting edge, they understand that, because you have people who are the head of, or at least the leadership. It may not necessarily be the CEO, because that could be
Mm.
just some powerful, um, some person that is very attractive to people. But the
Mm.
leadership of IT companies, they tend to understand. They've come up through the ranks, and they tend to understand that you just need to learn. You need to try things out, and you need to make mistakes and learn from those mistakes and keep going forward.
Mm.
But that's not necessarily the case in other industries.
Well, that's where I'm
And
wondering from that perspective. Again, do we need to be as the leaders? And this is where, because what has come out a lot is a lack of role models for boys and men, and probably generally anyway, but certainly for boys and men. When I grew up, I used to go to golf and lawn bowls with my dad, and then I'd be sent out. I think my dad got sick of me. No, being facetious. But you play golf as a four, so I would go off with three other guys for four and a
mhm,
half hours walking around a golf course I think I was 12 or something like that.
mhm,
So I got these, role model experiences, and the guys that I was with, I don't remember anything misogynistic or anything like that, but it was very, they were men that were, I was obviously a young kid asking for advice. So I learnt, to ask for advice, ask for questions. And I had
mhm.
these people guiding me. I mean, do we need more of that in society? Because then I'm going to pick on you now because you're American, and I saw the last presidential debate, which was really two
Mm.
narcissists beating each other over the head with their opinion. And that's probably putting it politely. Do we need to be encouraging our leaders to be more about being a good role model instead of being a jerk, to put it bluntly?
Uh, yeah, I think so, and I think it really has to happen more at the local level.
Mm.
I mean, the example you just gave was not necessarily who the Prime Minister of Australia was when you were 12. It
No.
was, you were walking around with three guys.
Yeah.
They were the
Yeah.
role models who made the who made
Yeah.
the impression on you. Like, hey man,
Mm.
don't cheat.
Yeah,
Like, I
yeah,
saw
yeah.
you did that. Don't pick up. You can't move your ball, man. We're not on the
Yeah.
green,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I'm not necessarily as worried about somebody like Donald Trump as I am about going to a little league baseball game and
Mm.
seeing some fathers act like 10-year-olds and being inappropriate and yelling at the umpire, the
Mm.
referee of baseball. That's become, I've gotten into some online debates about that, because we have a crisis in youth sports because they can't get enough people to referee.
Mm.
And so they'll say, okay, here's a basketball game that's supposed to take place, tomorrow at 10 a.m. and
Mm.
another one's supposed to take place at 12. Well, they're both canceled. Why? Because there's no refs.
Yeah.
And why aren't there refs? Because they're sick of, here's a young guy who's getting, or a young lady who's getting paid not much. They're just doing it to make a
A
little
lot of
money and to
times they're
try and help out.
volunteers.
Yeah, and they don't care. They
Mm.
don't care which group of 9-year-olds wins or loses, and yet they're being sometimes physically accosted by these idiots, who are the
Mm.
parents. So I think the leadership and the mentoring really has to come at that local level, and there has to be accountability. I was just reading online recently. I thought it was hilarious. This lady said that, I think she lives in Michigan. Anyway,
Mm.
their rule is, if you go ballistic and you start acting like a prick and you get in trouble and you're kicked out of the game as a parent,
Mm.
if you want to come back to any sporting event in that league, you must volunteer to referee 3 games.
I like that. That's awesome.
Yeah, and you figure, to be a referee, you're going to have to go through some training to be a referee,
Mm.
to learn the rules and to learn how to
Yeah.
deal with parents who are like you. That's the kind of accountability that we need. I mean, if people are going to be that unhinged and that disrespectful, then it's almost like fire with fire. I, I really think that, and I was watching the interview that you did with the lady, and she was talking a lot about manners
Mm.
and being polite and how far that goes in society. But unfortunately, if you have people who've completely lost sight of that and they just don't care about manners anymore, then you're going
Mm.
to have to, you're going to have to like come down a little more stringently on the people who act like that. That's just the way it is. What about is there a problem like that in youth sports in Australia, or
It's
how
a
do they deal with unruly parents?
Yeah, it's not something I've experienced with my over 14-year-old son and with his sports. I don't experience that a lot, but we're probably not in the demographic where that would occur a lot. He goes to a high-end private school where they actually do keep score, so there's no participation trophies. Which I
Yeah.
wonder about that, whether that's creating this the fact that, as you mentioned before about failing, that it's okay. There is only one winner in those, and that's why it's designed that way. That's what competition is for. So you actually pushes you to be better, not just
Hmm.
because you get
Hmm.
a pat on the back because you showed up. That's what competition is, to push you to be better. There is one winner. It's not that you're a lesser person because of that. It's how do okay, how I didn't do as well as I could have, or the other side was better. So how do I be
Hmm.
better? Or how do I
Exactly.
find something that's better suited for me? I mean, if I was to go and be a jockey, I probably wouldn't do very well. I'm 6 foot tall. It's not going to work. I need to
Hmm.
find other
Hmm.
areas. So yeah, I'm not, but I know it does happen. I know that it's. I haven't seen so much in the news about it, but it does happen where there are parents, and I'm not sure how they deal with that. But that's where I wonder from that respect thing, and I do push it back to, we go, okay, well, you've got children learning from parents, and they see the parent behaving badly. And you mentioned before about social
Yeah.
media. Parents complain, and I've watched them do that, where they'll complain about their children always on social media while they're complaining they're on their own phone texting someone or doing some social media or something like that.
Right.
Um, and it's something that I haven't had an issue with my son, because my phone's lived on silent for, I think, about 8 years now. It literally doesn't beep. My computer doesn't beep. I don't have any alerts telling me
Mm.
how many messages I've got. If I want to find out if I've got a message or got a phone call, I need to look at my phone and actually
Mhm.
see whether I missed a call or not, or got a message.
Mhm.
And he's seen that. I didn't realize how much of an impact that had until we were going out and with some of my friends, and he was coming, and it was just him, none of his friends or anything like that. It was him and a bunch of my friends. And I noticed his phone he left it on his desk. I said, "Oh, do you want to grab your phone because you might be bored?" And he goes, "No, I don't need it."
Mm,
Um, and that's that role modeling, but that's where I want to take it that step further. And I was on the talk show on one of the local radios here, asking
mm.
that question: do we need to be holding our leaders, our politicians, to account and say, hey, what you're doing as a role model is an example for the adults who are then an example for the children? Is that, something that we need to be looking at?
I think so. I think so, definitely. And I think what happened, or what's happened with this kind of culture of frankly, adults who are just out of control, is that yeah, nobody's holding them accountable. I mean, we do
Mm,
talk about phones and whatnot. On the other hand, you have all of these things that previously would never have been filmed. There
mm,
wouldn't be that accountability. I'm thinking back when I was playing youth sports.
mm,
There was no camera. Nobody would have been caught for anything, and it would be wonderful for me to sit here and act like no adult back then was out of control. But that's just not the case.
mm,
It didn't happen as much, but I remember times where a parent
mm,
just, typically a father, was just out of control, and nobody captured that. We were
mm,
all just there to witness it. So at least
mm,
now you do have people who it's not just at sports, but it could be somebody who's being really, condescending to somebody who's working at a restaurant or whatever. And now you do have some kind of, accountability. There's this, what they call, oh, Karen, Karen at Starbucks or whatever. And there's been people who've been
I've got to be
fired,
careful with that because
right?
one of the groups I work with that works in the family violence space, and the lady who founded the organization, that's her name, and it's like she's doing such
I
a
feel
wonderful
bad for
job.
anyone named Karen. Oh my
She's such a
God.
caring and very intelligent woman, and it's like it's just unfortunate.
Right. Exactly. And who came up with that? I mean, why
Yeah.
Karen? Why not Trish or whatever?
Yeah. It
Um,
used to be Tiffany, wasn't it? They'll key your cars or something like that. If you go out with a Tiffany and you break up, your car's going to get keyed.
right.
But from that
Crazy.
side of things, with that, again, this respect, I mean, and this is what I find ironic, and I'm going to pick on government because you can, and to me, they're the leader anyway. They talk about respect, behaving with
Mm,
respect. Certainly in the family violence space, they talk about respect. And that's where, do we, again, encouraging from that perspective of young boys saying, "Hey, the respect is, respect for yourself," and you do that by being nice. I mean, I reference pop culture a lot, and one of my favorite movies is, Patrick Swayze in Roadhouse, where he's a bouncer, but his philosophy is be nice. Ask them to leave, be nice. Escort them to door,
mm.
be nice. Um, because you can still achieve anything you want to by well, actually, I think you've got more chance of success by being nice in how you approach things. Do we need more education around that?
I think so. I'll tell you an interesting story. When I first moved to San Francisco, and I was doing some substitute teaching
Mm,
just to make some money. And I'm not a really big or imposing, intimidating guy. And I was teaching this high school class, and there's this young guy, and he's just walking around. He's this immense guy, but he's kind of walking around and absolutely with not a care in the world about what was happening in the class that I was trying to speak. Or I mean, as a substitute, I didn't get up there and lecture. It was more like, hey, here are the things we need to do. But I think a young lady was trying to answer a question or whatever, and and instead of like raising my voice or whatever, I just walked up to him and I just said, "Excuse me, sir." I treated him the way I would treat somebody,
mm,
like say if I worked in a hotel. I was a waiter. I worked in a lot of
mm,
restaurants, so I had that kind of customer service mentality, right? Um, so I just said very politely, like, Excuse me, sir, she's trying to answer, and we can't. hear her answer because you're walking around. If you could please just take your seat and give her a chance to answer, then I would appreciate that." I said it as politely as I could.
Mm.
I think this kid was completely shocked that anyone spoke to him with any kind of respect. He was this immense guy, and he just said, "Okay." And he just kind of shrugged his shoulders and went and sat down and shut up for the rest of the class
Mm.
and was nice. I mean, my thinking with that is like going back to whatever Patrick Swayze is. You can always, if you think of it as kind of a pendulum or a continuum,
Mm.
you can always go from there and move back in the other direction. You
Yeah.
can always go back to being a jerk and go like, all right, here's how it's going to be, asshole.
Yeah. Yeah.
You can always do that, but you can't go the other way. You
Yes.
can't start out, for example, I couldn't walk up to this young man
Mm.
and get in his face and be ballistic and then try to turn polite after that. It's disingenuous. Nobody's buying it.
Mm.
It's offensive. It just doesn't work that way. So it only goes one way. It goes in
Mm.
one direction. You start out by being polite, and then you can kind of ratchet up the
Mm.
pain if you have to. But yeah, always just and understand that people are dealing with different things. You really don't know what's going on until you talk to them about things.
Mm. And that's what I was wondering from that, coming back to that point, do we need to be listening? Because and asking those questions, that example of what you've talked about before, I've had some of my son's friends come and stay, and some of them have been, I'd put on the side of being a little bit of a jerk. And I wonder, does that come down to, the attention that they're getting? Because sometimes, you know, that's when kids get attention by misbehaving. They're getting attention when they don't behave. Parents on phone, not really paying attention to it. It's only when the kid misbehaves and they learn that behavior. And one of these
Mm,
children was, from my son's school a few years ago, was coming over and
mm.
he was behaving a little bit. And I just asked, I said, excuse me, is that a respectful way to behave? And it's like exactly like you were talking about. And the
Mhm.
response was different and the behavior for the rest of the day was very different.
Mm.
And it's just wondering, is it that case where, again, the whole role modeling, treating people with respect, listening to people, teaching people how to listen, to actually really listen. A lot of the times when we're talking with someone, we say we're listening, but we're really thinking about what we're going to say next.
Yeah, and I think you handled that very well, and you really don't know like what the living situation is for that child,
Mm.
right? Um, but yeah, I've had a lot of friends over the years who are my son's friends, and yeah, sometimes somebody will say something, and I'm thinking like, "Do you speak that way to your father?" Um, or just even stuff. I remember one guy was like, "Hey, dude, get me a soda or something," and it's like, um, yeah, that's not gonna fly. The funny thing is that what I would do with my kids when they were little, so for
Mm.
example, if my daughter just barged in the door and said, "I want an ice cream" or something, and
Mm.
she wasn't paying attention to the fact that I was on a conference call or that I was talking to somebody or that I was whatever, it's just like I would just say, "Let's try that again." I said, "Can you just leave the room and come in and ask in the way that
Mm.
you're supposed to ask?" And then she would come in and say, "Excuse me." I would say, "Yes, may I please have an ice cream?" "Yes, you may." And I would go get it for her. I probably had to do that twice in her
Mm.
entire childhood. So it's not like something you have to keep doing over and over and over again. But I think also with parenting, when there's a problem, sometimes we want to jump in and come based on our own emotions, our own ego, or the fact that something is really bothering us. We want to just jump in and solve it right now.
Mm.
And what I've found is if it's a bigger problem, maybe a bigger issue that keeps coming up, it's important to just take a step back. And one time there was a thing with my son, and I probably took 3 or 4 days to just really think like, how should I handle this? Because if I don't handle it correctly, I'm going to be pushing him in the wrong direction. I'm going to pretty much ensure that he doesn't do what I want him to do because
Mm.
I've either been obnoxious or I've just used kind of the wrong logic or whatever. So it was a situation where I just thought, okay, I'm not going to do it this way or this way. I'm going to take this approach, and it actually worked. So yeah, I think a lot of times people don't need to solve something right now. It's more the best explanation I've heard is it is like a long novel, right? Your life is
Mm.
this novel, and there's all these characters in it. And you have to think, you've got a 14-year-old son. Like, well, how do you want the novel to end?
Mm.
You might think of a problem that you want to solve right now, before he's 15. But it's more like, okay, well, how do you want the novel to end where you know you're in your 70s, he's in his 50s or whatever, and like,
Mm.
you're way down the road in this novel, and a lot of things have happened, the ups and downs, but how do you want that book to end in a way that's kind of beneficial for everybody involved? That's the
Yeah,
best
that's a good.
explanation I've heard for kind of dealing with these things, is really think long term.
Yeah, I like that because I have that experience a lot with my son where I'll ask him, have you thought about what you want to do after you leave school? And, he hasn't. And I just kind of leave the conversation there. Okay, no problem. Because, when I think back about when I was that age, I certainly hadn't thought about it. But it's just prompting that question. But from that perspective as well, there's some boundaries that I do set. There's certain behaviors. It's more about character, and that's always been the case from when he was little. It was always about, developing the character because very few people, I believe, or from what I've seen, will change their character, but we can always learn new knowledge. So I thought, well, let's get a good foundation of character with him. But do we need, for boys and men, do you think that we have probably a more of a firmer approach is needed because we're not as compliant, generally speaking. Men males
Right.
don't are not as what is it? Compliance not the right word, but we're not we're more likely to rebel, and as part of that, we need to
Sure.
have some sort of firmer boundaries. Is that do you think that's appropriate for boys?
I think so. I think, boys, or a lot of boys, tend to be just more defiant.
Mm.
And I think it's really coming down to just being present and
Mm.
having more positive males around them. And
Hmm.
it's not about giving like the perfect speech. It's just being there. Um,
Yeah.
so I'll tell you something that left a big impression on me. My sister Kathy, she passed away, but of cancer.
Oh,
But
sorry
anyway,
to hear.
thank you. She taught special needs kids at a school,
Mm.
and she was very funny, tough, tough lady. But anyway, she was great to talk to. We had this conversation on the phone, and she was talking about her school, and she said, the last man just left. This was a
Mm.
small, what we would call it K through 8. So these are
Mm.
kindergartens up till about 12 or 13-year olds.
Mm.
She said the last man just left, and I said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, this one teacher, this man,
Mm.
retired, and there's not one adult male on the campus at all.
Wow.
So
Wow.
you have, and I thought, and we both talked about that. What if you had two daughters and they went to a school and every single teacher was a man? You go in
Mm.
the office, the principal, the vice principal, those are two men. The nurse is a man. the
Mm.
the administrative assistant, the person running the office, that's a man. She goes out. Your two daughters go out to recess. Everybody watching everybody at recess, those are men. They go into the cafeteria. Those are men serving their food. There's
Mm.
not one adult woman on that campus. Wouldn't you be a little concerned for your
Mm.
daughters? That despite their good intentions,
Mhm.
despite all these teachers and administrators and all these people at the school, despite their good intentions and not trying to, be bad to your daughters, wouldn't it be, difficult for them to just kind of understand where they were coming from? And that's
Mm.
what she was saying about her school. It was just the opposite. And since we think of a lot of, especially teachers of younger kids, historically have been women, and I think
Mm.
that also leads to them, being that so many of them are women. I think is also connected to the lower pay,
Mm.
right? Because there's this prejudice we have that, oh, if it's a bunch of younger, or if it's a bunch of, women teaching these kids, well, it must not be that hard. Let's not pay them as much. I think that there's maybe
Okay.
some connection, with that, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, that's a huge problem, and it's not something that people talk about very much. Is this difficulty just having adult men around the kids, especially in younger kids when they're in school, and especially with so many young
Mm.
boys who don't have a father around.
It's an interesting point that you mentioned there because again, there are, and that's why there's a couple of topics I wanted to explore. There was one is, obviously it was very important, and I think it very valid to raise women up, to have the female empowerment movement that women can get out there and do things, and that's very valid. What seems to happen from what's been pointed out to me from the discussions I've had, and most of this is actually coming from women, is as a result of that, they've actually gone, instead of empowering women and keeping men where they are, it's actually been, there's been movement to disempower men. And there's a number of women that are certainly that are dealing with here in Australia and worldwide, where they're talking about, we need to actually, the women have had the empowerment movement, men haven't. We need to bring the men back up, because it certainly wasn't about disempowering them. The other component of that was what you were talking about, is this difference in how men and women do behave. We are biologically, we're different. And don't you love it when you get to a certain age and you start quoting your parents and recognizing their knowledge? But my mum used to say, men and women are different. They both have strengths, and by coming together, you become more. I'm
Mm,
paraphrasing a little bit, but that's what I got growing up. And what you're talking about there with the schools was really fascinating, because my son, he went to his stepdaughters or half sisters went to, not his stepdaughters, my stepdaughters.
okay.
His half sisters had two older half sisters that went to an exclusive girls' private school,
Mm,
and very wonderful education, but at the preschool level, they actually took boys in as well, so boys could be there, but it was only for that preschool thing. From prep onwards, they went to, it was only girls. But what was interesting, when one of the first meetings we had with the teachers, was they said, he doesn't, he's always busy and he's making train noises a lot. And I was going, isn't that what boys do? And I was
yeah.
thinking to myself as well, I was going, I make sound effects when I work. I'm 50. So well, it wasn't then, but I
Yeah.
still do
Yeah.
that. And I just, from what you're talking
Sure.
about, that having that balance is really important. But have we, because we've pushed down as opposed to just raised up women, we've pushed down men, that's why we've lost them. And I know I was reading reports in the about in the higher end professions, your lawyers, your doctors, accountants, those kind of, because only 40% of men are getting higher education. Now they're struggling to find men to fill the roles. And is that, have we gone too far from that perspective of, pushing men down as opposed to just raising women up?
I think it probably depends on the industry, and I also think that it, at least in our society, maybe coming from this, um, I don't know, Judeo-Christian
Mm.
sensibility, that if you're winning, I must be losing, right?
Mm. Yeah.
that
Well, that's an older,
the
when we,
opposite of, yeah,
yeah,
like, a rising tide lifts all boats. That, that's what you want it to be, but I think
yeah.
sometimes there is this, you're gonna choose one over the other. What were you
Mm.
gonna say? I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, I was going to add to that by the comment of, we originally we lived in a zero sum game. That was the world. For you to succeed, someone else had um, to be less. That's why there was plundering and wars. That you take the other person's
Sure.
resources so you could be better off. But the Industrial Revolution changed that. Innovation
Mhm.
gave us the ability to make a bigger pie where everyone could have more. But maybe we haven't caught up to that mentality of, by helping others, we're actually helping ourselves.
Right, and if you think of what I hope doesn't happen is that we have this, pendulum swing wildly back and forth, where
Mm,
I could see a situation where they say, for example, where some maybe hospital system says, we're going to have all of our nursing staff, we're going to have 50% men, 50% women. And what happens is they go out hiring men just because they're men,
mm,
and maybe the local schools are only, they're out of 600 graduates, maybe only 100 of them are men, but you're going to
Mm.
take all 100 of them to meet your quota that you've promised. And it's like, well, maybe those 100 guys are not, I doubt if all 100 of those guys, deserve to be in an emergency room. That's just life. That's just reality, right? Every
Mm.
class is going to have stronger and weaker people. So, yeah,
The
I think it's
quotas, I mean, I
important just
know,
not to overreact.
yeah, the quotas do exist, and there is that mandate. I've been on boards where government boards, well,
Mhm.
been part of government boards as well. So I haven't been on all of them, but some of them have been at the board meetings where they've talked about, and these are government organisations saying, for us to get funding, we need to appoint more women, and they're just
Mm.
looking at appointing anybody so they can fill a
Oh,
quota. And that's well, detrimental. I mean, it's great you want to empower women 100%. I completely agree. You want to empower women, but I've seen it where people have been appointed to roles where they actually weren't qualified for that role.
mm,
And then it creates then that creates a whole bunch of angst because this person's expecting to do all this stuff. They weren't qualified to start with,
mhm.
and they can't do it. They don't, and having that, how often does someone get appointed to a role that, and then recognize, oh, maybe I'm not qualified for that? That rarely happens. It becomes detrimental for the organization, becomes detrimental for the people. It's really, it's a sad situation. But how do we? I mean, when we're talking about men from that perspective, I mean, we want to encourage that inclusiveness. Is it a case of, again, that you talked about this, a rising tide raises all ships? We need to go, okay,
Mhm.
by encouraging people to learn and grow, that's a good thing.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, going back to what you were saying, one of the problems with appointing people in those roles also is that you have people who get into the position who are qualified, who are prepared, and yet everyone's calling their experience and their qualifications into question because they understand that there's a system that exists that just are putting random people in. So you
Mm,
also have this kind of there's what's the expression, imposter syndrome.
mm,
But I think when we think of imposter syndrome, it's typically used as a personal thing, right?
mm,
I'm this vice president and I shouldn't be here, right? But I
mm,
think it's also external too. It's people pointing at you and saying, you're not supposed
mm.
to be in this role. Because of nepotism or whatever that may be. So I think it becomes, even more pernicious. It's just when you do things for the wrong reasons, it's just this ripple effect
Mm.
of things that go wrong. But going back to young, not just young men, but young kids. I mean, there's so many different um, roles and different types of jobs
Mhm.
that young people don't even know about,
Mm.
right? And there's so many things that we need them to do, and that we need people to be skilled at. That I think even in this country, there's so many, like with COVID. You talk to somebody who's like, "Look, we need our roof put on."
Mm.
You need something practical done, right? You're like, hey, our toilet doesn't work. We need somebody to come, and there's nobody to come and do it because people are
Mm.
not doing it, and the ones who are doing it are backlogged for 5 months or whatever. And these are good, high-paying jobs, and we need to
Mm.
be funneling people into these different industries where they are respectable, and they require a lot of hard work and knowledge to do
Maybe
them
that's where
instead of.
AI is going to help us because, from what I understand, with what's available now with AI, it's going to replace a lot of the lower end white collar workers. And for the blue collar
Interesting.
workers, they're in a great position now because there is a lack of that, and it's great. There's certainly higher wages in that space. Maybe that's going to help that shift because an AI can't fix your toilet. It's not,
Yeah,
can give
Chat
you
GPT
instructions,
is
but it's
not
not
going to
going to be
come
able to do
put
it.
Chat GPT is not going to come put a roof on my house. It's
Yeah,
just not.
yeah.
So yeah, that's very interesting.
No, I just wonder because the demographics have really have changed the way the world is. I mean, the baby boomers are a lot of them. Most of them are retired, if not all of them are retired.
They are now,
And
yeah.
now we're in a space where we do have, I mean, not so much in, you're in America and I'm in Australia. Our
Mhm.
demographics are more column-like, but a lot of other countries are not. Where it's very, very. I mean, take Japan for example. It's one of the oldest demographics there is.
Yeah,
And they've
exactly.
adjusted reasonably well to that, but some other countries haven't. So I just wonder from that perspective how that's going to change, and what do we need from, again, men? Is it, we want to be working collaboratively? These are new problems we're going to have to face, and is that where we need to be encouraging, men and women? But this is about, what is manly? Those men that are sitting there lost, lonely, and not feeling useful in society. We'd
Mhm.
certainly be better off if they were actively participating.
Exactly, I mean, going back to Japan, my son was there for about 9 months, 8 or 9
Mm,
months last year,
mm,
just living with relatives and hanging out and,
yeah,
um, doing a
cool.
lot of rock climbing and taking online classes and things. But he made friends with this family, and he was telling me what a pretty common problem is that there's an entire kind of demographic in Japan who's just given up. These are young people who just said,
Mm,
"You know what? I'm not going to high school. I'm not doing anything. I'm not going to get a job." And
mm,
this is happening for kids that are only maybe 12 years old.
yeah.
And so now they're having special schools that are just for those kids that are done primarily online, but just
Mm.
trying to engage them in society at all. One of the part we haven't talked about my book at all, but right up here, where's there you are.
Yeah, that's it. We can see it.
The
The Driftwood
Driftwood
Tour.
Tour. One of the parts in there, the book has quite a few of the specific stories or things that happen to me.
Mm,
There's a part in Japan where the guy has to go to physical therapy, which I
mm.
did. I was on a motorcycle and was hit by a car, messed up my
Oh,
neck and my back,
oh.
and I had to go to physical therapy. And there were a few interesting and funny things that came out of that. One
Mm.
of the funniest things was the young hot rod kid who hit me had to come and pick me up and take me to all my physical therapy
Oh, wow.
as a form of remorse, to show remorse,
Yeah.
which he did not want to do. So it was like this. Here I am in a neck brace with Tokyo Drift, who's
Yeah.
just flying around taking me to the hospital to do my physical therapy. But the other part that most people don't even believe is that when I went to the physical therapy, everybody who worked there was completely blind.
Oh, really?
And right, so the people who would
Wow.
massage your neck and they would help you get into the machine and do it correctly. And
Mm.
I think the Japanese way of thinking is that not only not only can people with certain disabilities do a job,
Mm.
right, but they may actually be better at that job
Mm.
than someone else, right?
Mm.
So somebody who's and I knew somebody else who would go, and it was this like massage school where you learn like Reiki and um and the school was specifically for the blind.
Mm. So how did that, I mean, you mentioned about the book and writing your book, and you've
Mhm.
talked about, in the pre-show, we talked about you've done art for 20 years.
Yeah.
When we look at that as well, when we're looking at um, at men and, being, again, lost, lonely, not useful in society, have we lost that process? Because I can imagine the process of writing the book. Well, it's not
Mhm.
imagine it. The reality is it didn't happen overnight. You didn't go wake up in the morning and, the little elves. I don't know if you remember the elves in the shoemaker story. They didn't write the book for you in the night and you woke up and it was done. You actually had to do some effort.
Oh
Is
yeah.
that a case when you take us through that process of that? And do we need to be encouraging people to go, hey, you know, writing a book is pretty simple. You sit down
Mhm.
and you write about your story or whatever it is that you want to write about, but you've got to
Sure.
do it for a period of time before you're going to get the book finished. So the question I have
Right.
is, we always talk about working smarter and not harder, but so many
Mhm.
people are working harder. Do we need more for the young people to go, hey, this is pretty simple. You want money, spend less than or add some value first so you earn money, and
Sure.
then keep a little bit of what you earn, invest it, and reinvest the income. You'll be wealthy. It's not.
Mhm.
Mm,
Mhm.
it's going to happen.
It's
Do we
not
need more
rocket
about that with
surgery.
your example of your book?
Yeah, I think, and I think letting young people know that when you struggle, it's not necessarily a bad thing. That
Mm,
that struggle is there's whatever the 10,000 hour rule that you do need to just put in time and get better at something. And I think one of the analogies is there's so many young people, young men who are into gaming,
mm,
and I've heard uh, my son's friend or somebody say, "Well, I'm not that good at this game. I've only got 400 hours into it." Like 400 hours? That's a lot of time.
yeah,
I don't know what is I'm not a gamer,
yeah,
but
no,
I don't know what's considered kind of where you cross over
mm,
the precipice and start to get really good at something. But it's but I think I would encourage them to say, like, look, you're putting a lot of time into this, and you could be putting a lot of time into something else. Um, and that you would, even if you struggle with it, and even if it's not comfortable for you, it's always going to be useful at some point. There's the famous speech by Steve Jobs. I
mm,
don't know if you've seen it. It's the commencement address at Stanford University,
yeah,
and it's been viewed millions of times. But he
yeah,
he talks about the calligraphy class that he took
mm,
just because it was interesting to him.
mm,
He had no idea that and I guess the university he went to was very renowned for its beautiful calligraphy, and
mm,
the instructors over the decades. He had no idea as a young man that that would actually matter,
mm,
but it did. When they were building the first Mac, they had to think about spacing, and they had to think about serif and sans
mm,
serif, and that's the point in his speech. It's that he's trying to get people to say, you will be able to connect the dots at some point in the future in a way that may not seem that
mm.
obvious now.
Is that a
So
focus too? I mean, because when you look at the effort that you went in to write your book, the discipline that went there to write the book, you know, and you've got a lot of stories, and I'm sure you didn't write it and it was just magically done. There was rewrites and revisions, and
sure.
people gave you comments back and that kind of thing. Is it a
Mhm,
case
mhm.
too when you look at that? For example, I mentioned about 400 hours playing a video game, and my son
Mhm,
likes video. I like video games when I was younger, so I'm not going to criticize him for doing that. In fact,
mhm.
it was the opposite. He was playing, and to be fair, he does his homework. He gets good grades. He sets his own grades. I put that to him. You set your own grades, and he achieves it. Um, obviously as a parent, I'd probably say I'd liked it to be higher, but it's still pretty high. And so it's like, you
Yeah.
know, but it's not for me to say that. So hopefully he doesn't listen to this. I'm sure he won't. Um, it's dad stuff. Dad lectures me enough anyway. Um, but I just from that perspective of this discipline, because there was one day he was playing and he was trying to get the big boss, and he mentioned about how it took him 8 hours to kill the big boss of this time a number of times, and my response was, that's pretty awesome dedication. You're going to take that out into the
It
world, into
is.
other areas when you get there. Do we need to be encouraged rather than chastising the kids for doing stuff that they enjoy doing? Do we need to have more of that positive mindset of, and I don't like to use the word positive, but encourage them and find what they're doing as how to do it. Someone doing 400 hours on a video game to be good at it. That's a
Doing
good
anything.
analogy. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and I've been guilty of this too. And you get up in the middle of the night, and it's like, why is this light on? You know, like there shouldn't be lights on in the house at 3 a.m.
Yeah.
So I've been as guilty as anyone, but I do think, as adults, as parents, we do need to take a step back and go, what's actually going on here? Let's not
Mm,
overreact, and think about the different areas. A good friend of mine and his wife, his name's Kurt Squire, and his wife is Constance Steinkuhler, and they're both professors at University of California at Irvine,
mm,
and they study gaming and the
mm,
effects of gaming on society,
mm,
all over the world, and different games that are popular in Korea, different types of games, games where you're using strategy, or first-person shooter games,
mm.
and so they look at it from that perspective of how is this really affecting society, and the funny thing is now they have children, so they're also parents now, right? They don't want to wake up at
It's
3
funny how
a.m.
that
and see all
changes
the
your
lights
perspective
on.
on things, doesn't it?
I'm curious to get to pick his brain about that, right? But yeah, they do. They study just the effects of gaming on society, and I always enjoy talking to them just
Mm.
about. Um, for example, we think of like sweatshops. If I ask, well, what's a sweatshop? Well, it's a place. It's not a good place to be,
No, it's
and
not a
it's where
gym.
people. Yeah, it is not hot yoga. It's a place where people get paid very little to
Mm,
just bust out clothes. That's what we
mm.
would think of a sweat. Well, now they have sweatshops in China because what you have is you have games. If I if I have enough money and I'm in the first world and I don't want to spend 1,000 hours on this game to get this sword that's just going to allow me to kill anybody I want. Right? I don't want
Yeah,
to put 1,000 hours. I just want to buy the game, or I just want to buy the sword,
yeah.
and let's say $100, right? That's real money, and people are spending all of these things to upgrade
Wow.
and all of that, and so you have an entire industry in places like China where they just have really a sweatshop of people playing this game over and over and over again, getting the points up to win the sword,
Right.
and then they sell the
Oh.
sword on eBay or somewhere for real money,
Mm.
right? And so that's another thing that people it's one of those ugly things that people don't really want to talk about. Is like, okay,
Mm.
it's possible there's some 13-year-old girl busting her ass to win this thing so that you
Yeah.
can go buy it for $200 or whatever.
Wow.
And
That's
they told me
interesting.
that and it just blew my mind. I was like, oh Lord.
Yeah, I was not aware of that. That's yeah,
Yeah.
be better than, wandering around digging cobalt out of the ground in Congo. But anyway, that's another topic.
Go
Well, we mentioned electric cars earlier, and I love
right.
driving electric cars, but I'm also mindful of, that there's a whole other side too. It's not a renewable thing anyway, in
Right.
so many different ways. Let's before we go, can we just you've got your book there. Tell us about the book. Who is it for? What's it about? How you're trying to help with the book?
Yeah. So the Driftwood Tour, it really started out as I wasn't intending to write this novel. I had done all these travels and I started to put together all of these short stories just because I thought, okay, like I spent a summer backpacking through New Zealand and all this stuff. And I thought, well, I don't want to lose all these stories.
Mm,
But then I started to think about this character. And in a way, this guy that you see here is a guy named Wood. And in a way, he's very different from me. I grew up in a very large family
hmm
and he's an only child. He doesn't know his father. He doesn't have any siblings,
mm,
and his mother is very bitter based on the things that have happened in her life. And
mm,
so, but he, as a musician, he has this sidekick, a guy named Jesse, who, in a way, they're kind of opposites. Jesse's this African American guy from Louisiana who comes from middle class family, but his dad's around, his mom's around, his aunts and uncles, siblings, brothers and sisters, cousins. He has a very what you would call a functional family.
mm,
And so you have them kind of learning from each other. So I think from the kind of the male perspective, it does talk a lot about what we learn from the men around us and don't
mm.
learn, and how we
Yeah.
kind of pay a price for not having these people around. So, I think at first glance, it looks like a funny book about rock stars going around and partying down and all this stuff. But it's a book about family. It's
Mm,
really about family and friends. It's about connecting
hmm
with your father, connecting with the different people in your life over the years, and how people
mm,
kind of come together. And it's really a book about humility too. This is a guy who's living
mm,
a pretty charmed life, and then everything starts to unravel and fall apart very quickly, and he ends up in Japan and just kind of has to come to terms with all of the decisions that he's made up to that point.
Sounds like if you were using that as an analogy, there's a bunch of different things in there for a framework for being manly. If you got to sum that up, how would that fit?
Um, Yeah, that's interesting because like this guy, in a way, it's interesting because my father was around, but
Hmm.
my father had a very interesting childhood. He grew up in an orphanage,
Mm.
and even though he had family around there, this was during the Great Depression,
Hmm.
and his mother passed away, and men did not raise little toddlers, right? They just
No.
didn't back then. So he was
Yeah.
just put into an orphanage, and
Wow.
he spent 10 years there.
Wow.
So there's a lot of that where I was raised by a man who was was very loving, but
Mm.
was honestly like flying blind, as the
Yeah.
expression goes. So, in some ways, very funny ways. I didn't put them all in the book or anything, but for example, my father had worked for the courts. And so he was, there were always like police officers. He was always talking to police officers. An ironic thing is he didn't really trust the police because he grew up kind of like a little young punk.
Yeah.
Um, but one funny story was they when I was at school and we were little kids, everyone had these switchblade combs,
Yeah. I know the
like
type. Yeah. Yeah.
right,
Yeah.
but it was actually a comb.
Yes.
And my father, not really knowing, kind of like just making it up as he went along, some police officer had given him an actual switchblade that they had taken off of a Hell's Angel.
Oh, okay.
And he comes home, and I'm only like 9 years old, and he's like, "Hey, you want a switchblade?" And I was like, "Okay." So I bring that to school. So the other kids have switchblade combs, and I was like, "Here's my switchblade," and it was an actual blade
Yeah.
from a Hell's Angel. So there were times, even as a little kid, I would be thinking like, um, just in my own mind, like, I don't think I'm supposed to have a switchblade, right? Like, I don't think we're supposed to be doing things like this. So,
Yeah.
um, but I'm really thankful in some ways that my dad was very. There were things that he was conscious of ending,
Mm.
right? Because growing up in an orphanage, those kids were beaten. He was physically abused.
Mm.
And when I was a kid, and people would talk about, oh, my dad, took off his belt and whooped me, and it's like my father. He could be very intimidating, but he did not physically hit us
Mm.
because he wanted that to die. He wanted
Mm.
that kind of pattern to just end,
Yeah.
right? And I remember when he passed away, he wrote poetry. My father was a voracious reader, and he would write poetry. And one of the lines that he wrote was like, "I'm proud of all of the painful stories I might have retold, but chose to keep to myself."
Mm. That's interesting.
Right? Which we can debate about how healthy that is, to keep all
Depends
of
on
these
how you
stories
deal
to
with it.
yourself.
My grandfather was like that. I mean, he escaped from 2 concentration camps during World War II. He was shot twice. We never found out any of that until after he died. He wouldn't let people talk about it. He never talked about it. He wouldn't let others talk about it. He was kind of like the leader in that area of the group that
Wow.
was there. And it was only after he died some of his friends shared those stories. Um, and I can
Where
understand. I
was he
mean,
stationed?
he was. I'm Polish, Ukraine, and Russian origin, all combination.
Oh,
But my grandfather was Polish and Russian on my dad's
okay.
side. My grandmother was Polish,
Okay.
and so he, when obviously the Nazis invaded
Mm,
Poland, he was part of the military at the time, and then joined the Polish resistance, and
mm,
yeah, and things happen that way. But it's interesting. People can debate about whether you. I think it's more so how you actually address it, as to whether you need to speak about it um, publicly, or if you address it in a way that's not harmful for you, maybe you don't need to. Um,
mhm, mhm.
I know from my perspective, and I've got a lot of that from my grandfather. My dad says I have a lot of his traits, but
Mm,
I can deal with things without having to tell people all of the nitty gritty. I mean, I have some safe spaces where if I need to, I can, and I'll always
yeah.
ask for help. But it's interesting from your perspective, hearing that from your dad, and how much of that went into the book.
I think a lot of it in some of the funny ways. I mean, and this protagonist here is a guy named Wood, and his, he's a musician. His mother had an affair in music school
Mm,
in a university with a professor,
mm,
and then that's the scandal. The professor, you know, gets her pregnant, and then gets
mm.
fired, sues the school for wrongful termination, gets a bunch of money, and leaves town.
Yeah.
That's
Wow.
why she's bitter. And I went to this, book club. It was this ladies' book club, and they were like, "Well, I didn't really like her. I didn't like his mom. I didn't like
Mm,
Charlotte." And I said, "Well, I didn't write her to be liked. I
mm,
wrote her in a way that all of the things that she said and did made sense,
mm,
right? If I was, she she was this close to getting her degree and didn't, and didn't get her degree, didn't get any money, didn't get the love, and why wouldn't you be bitter if something like
mm.
that happened to you?" So she kind of represented, um, I think, a lot of women whose whatever dreams just kind of died in their own way, and the
Mm.
bitterness that comes from that, right? And so what I wrote on, I did a big rewrite of the book, and during the rewrite I really pulled his father into it, and this desire to know his father, and um all of the things that he realized that he's lost, like when he
Mm.
finally, I don't want to ruin the book too much, but he finally
Spoiler alert.
tells his father, that I became famous, and in the hopes that I would look out in the crowd and see you there.
Mm.
But after a while I realized that it was easier to just not trust people than to
Uh,
keep looking for people who were never going to be there anyway.
From your perspective with that, and you mentioned about the character, and you just said, I didn't write her to be liked. I remember Steve Jobs talking about, because you mentioned Steve Jobs earlier. And he
Mhm.
talked about, some people, said that they didn't like him. And he goes, well, it's not a popularity contest. I'm running a company. Um, from that perspective as well, I mean, and you look at, you talked about having a book club, and we're talking about being manly and stereotypical manly. Um, I mean, because I look at it, I was in the special forces here. I was posted to the SAS. And one of the guys there is probably, I think, is one of the most lethal guys there.
Mhm.
He
Mhm.
wasn't, an Arnold Schwarzenegger, well built or anything like that. He was quite slender. He was very, very fit.
Yeah.
Um, and his hobby, the thing that he was passionate about outside of his work, which is kind of might be scary in and of itself, but the thing that he was passionate about was sewing. He used to
Okay.
sew. He took in my pants when I lost weight. So when you look at that and you're going, well, being manly, and that's why I'm referencing
Right.
the book club as well. You go, you're a guy. When you think of book clubs, it's not generally something you think of guys doing. But is that the what we're shattering now? Is there is all this diversity out there of men, and that they were always doing that anyway. But it's just
Right.
where we've got the ability to publicize that more. Is that what's happening?
I think it's healthy when people I mean, as long as you're not doing something that's hurting people.
Mm.
And I think it is cool that somebody, like some guy who could literally kill you with his hands, is, he's got a thimble, and
Yeah,
right,
no,
and he's like, "Here, let
he had
me."
a couple of sewing machines and stuff like that, and he was always he was on base because we were on
Right.
base together, and he
Right.
had one of the storerooms converted to his sewing room. So
Yeah.
he had a sewing room on a special forces army base. That was his thing.
And it's a wonderful argument. If someone is such a, I don't want to say a tough guy, but if someone is such a capable
Mm.
man or woman, why do they need to be ashamed of telling anybody anything?
Well, that was the thing here, and that's why I'm
Right.
wondering from that perspective, because he never was. He wasn't hiding it. He
Yeah.
just did his thing, and probably if you knew it, but even if you didn't know him, he had a confidence about this was right for him. And same token
Hmm.
by you, I'm watching you talk and talk about your book and the book club, and there's a confidence about you that you're comfortable with that. Is that what we're talking about when we look at a framework for being manly? It's finding what are you comfortable about, and having the courage to just do that.
Yeah, I think that, um, the more that we can be comfortable in our own skin,
Mm,
regardless of where we are in the world, our age, the job we're doing, um, the healthier. Because I think, like, okay, if I can give anything, if I can give this planet one less jerk to deal with, that's a pretty significant gift if you had millions of people who truly felt that
mm,
way,
yeah,
right? And so just I remember there was an interview with what was his name? Jack Welch. Jack Welch was the General Electric. He was considered one of the great
yeah,
CEOs, and he didn't interview people anymore. HR did all of that. But when
mm,
he sat down with like the head of HR at
yeah,
General Electric and said, they would say, "Well, what directions would you give that person?" And he would say,
mm,
"I don't care if they're in IT or operations or whatever, or design and marketing, just hire people who are comfortable in their own skin." And if you
mm,
look back, Damien, if you look back at the people you've dealt with, right, the people in school, the people in different jobs who were kind of like a bull in a china shop, right,
mm,
who were just constantly hurting people left and
mm,
right for different reasons, they were typically not comfortable in their own skin.
mm,
There was typically something about them, I think, that where they were kind of, lashing out,
yeah.
right? Do you find that that's the case sometimes?
Definitely, there's a lot of frustration there, and from the perspective of who they are. I think when I look at my own journey as well, there was times where I've done things, and I look back and go, that probably wasn't the best way to behave.
Mm,
And part of that was my upbringing and what I'd learnt as to how to react in those situations.
mhm,
And then from that perspective of being less of a jerk and going, okay, now actually I'm well, and that's what it was. There was behaviors where it was just I was yelling at someone because they parked where the bride was going to park, and it's like I
mm.
was looking after the bride, but it's my intention was good. That's why I don't feel bad about it in the sense of, I don't feel guilty about that. That's why I can't be a Catholic anymore. I don't feel guilt anymore. Facetiously say. But it's one of those things where you go, okay, I made that mistake and now I want to do things. And that's where I want to come back to that point you just mentioned before. You said if I can give the world something, I mean, from that perspective, that was one thing that I find was guiding for me was I wanted to leave wherever it was, a little bit better. And when I looked at, sometimes I go, well, maybe my behavior there wasn't contributing to that being better. So how can I improve me? And that was part of
Mhm.
that focus. Is that, and when we're talking again, to get people, guys, being lost and lonely, if you're focused on yourself, well, that's a pretty lonely place to be if you're focusing on yourself. If you focus on other people, all of a sudden you're not so lonely anymore.
I mean, it's such a great point because there is that dichotomy, and we do have to grow. We do have to look inward and
Yeah.
just be
An
honest.
airplane's crashing, you put your mask on first. Yeah, we get that.
Sure, sure. Yeah, and just learning simple skills like better listening skills, and I
Mm,
think you mentioned, listening with the intention of, well, what am I going to say next?
mm,
You know, but yeah, and I think going back to like to young people, it's important just to learn how to be a human being, how to be a decent citizen, right?
mm,
How to be just and go from like the inside out. Your little circle is going to be family, and then the people who live near you, the people you work with, the people you go to school with. How do you just be decent to those people and then kind of build from there? I think sometimes
mm.
we have much bigger focus on the people who are on television, for example,
Yeah.
right? They're kind
That
of easy targets.
Well, I mean, and from that perspective, and I have that, and I've raised it a couple of times too. We look at, for guys, James Bond has probably been, a role model in a way or an aspiration that people would want to be like them. Super successful, suave, confident, all that kind of stuff. Encapsulates so much.
Mhm.
Um, and I look at it, in a 2-hour movie, you might see him talk to what, two women, and he's successful with them. Um,
Right.
And I had a friend when I was in the army, and he dated some, amazing women. They were beautiful, intelligent, really kind. They were just amazing. He was a good looking guy, and but I didn't think he was that bright. And I asked him about that. I said, I did. I said, Shane, you're
Right.
not that bright. How are you
Like,
dating all these great women?
what's the deal? Yeah.
Yeah.
Show
And
me what's your secret.
he didn't, react at all to the not bright comment, but he just turned into this sensei, wise old, Yoda maybe, and put his arm around my
Mm,
shoulder and said, Damien, what you don't see is I ask a lot. Most say no. You just see the ones that say yes. And I
mm,
wonder from that perspective, because maybe we are lacking those role models, we lose sight of reality and think, I saw, James Bond chat to one girl and was successful, but I didn't see, in that 2 hour movie, you didn't see all the other women that he'd talked to and who'd said no, because that's reality in real life. There's no magic formula where you'll talk to a girl and all of them will like you.
right.
We're different, and we have certain, people, there's certain people that you'll be attracted to and connect with, other people you won't. Um, and do we need to be having more discussion around that and just say, hey, yeah, that's a movie, that's fun, that's a snapshot, though.
Yeah, and it's a great debate about who are our role models, right?
Mm,
Who should our role models even be? I watch something like James Bond, and I'm thinking like, um, where are all the suitcases? He's getting now he's at a party in some new Tom Ford, like some badass tuxedo or whatever, and I'm like, well, okay,
that's a
how much
good.
stuff is this guy traveling with, right? He just killed somebody in a wetsuit, right?
Yeah.
And now he's at a gambling table, like he's on the red carpet or something like that. So I think we have to be very careful about the role models we choose. Um, but I guess he is, James Bond is kind of representation of kind of every aspiration, right?
Mm,
Like the the ability to just get things done, to defend yourself.
mm,
There's a part in the book about where this guy Wood, he didn't have an older brother, he didn't have a father around, and he goes
mm.
to Hull. He goes to Hull, England,
Yeah.
and the crowd attacks them. It's a funny scene,
Yeah.
but the crowd attacks them. They shower them with beer because they try to play a House Martins song in Hull, which is where the House Martins were from. So it's this jangly, happy song
Yeah.
called Happy Hour. And the crowd beats, someone hits him with a bottle of beer, like throws the bottle and hits him in the face. So he goes psychotic,
Yeah.
jumps into the crowd. Well, literally does not know how to throw a punch.
Yeah.
Nobody taught him how to throw a punch. So he
Mm,
just gets the living shit beat out of him by this English guy.
yeah.
And then they go back to the hotel. He's got, he's bleeding and all that. And then his
Mm,
buddy, Jesse, says, all right, you need to know how to throw a punch. If you're going to be getting in bar fights and that's not a good, you do not have a good system, right?
mm,
You lose your cool, get in a fight, and you actually cannot fight at all. So he teaches him how to throw, one good
mm.
punch, right? So like going back to James Bond, and we need to be able to do these basic things. We also need to be able to like sit down in a restaurant and know which utensils to use and not look like we're some caveman at a barbecue,
Mm,
right? I
mm.
mean, I think in real life we have like the tough Bear Grylls guy,
Yeah.
right? The tough survivalist. And then you have the other extreme, which is kind of like Brian Ferry. Cool. I'm a big Brian Ferry fan. This whole book is about music. Brian
Yeah.
Ferry's just like Mr. Suave,
Yeah.
polite, good manners. I've seen him in concert. He seems like just a good guy, but um, I wouldn't expect him to be like beating the crap out of people. So I think it always begs the question is like, what does it mean to be a capable
Mm.
adult man or a
Well, it was
capable adult
interesting what
woman?
you're saying there. I mean, because you take that a step further. I was fortunate. I had a role model who was a duke, and I remember this when I was younger. And I asked him. I said, because we're talking about dinner and having dinner, and how do you do things, at the dinner in a proper way. And
Hmm.
this is from a duke, and he says, "Well, you do what's right for you, and you do it confidently." Said, if you want to
Hmm.
eat the bread with your hands, you eat the bread with your hands. You do what's
Hmm.
right for you. Um, And it was interesting, that analogy. It's you go, well, because when you look at different cultures, what we consider, if you, especially our friends who are Indian, a lot of the food they eat with their fingers. We'd go, oh, that's
Right.
horrible, but they do it, and so, and that was really interesting from that perspective, having that role model who said he was a Duke, and he goes, do what's right for you. Which ironically, another mentor, he was the managing director and chairman of BP, and
Well,
advice he was always, when I asked him for advice, he'd wait a few days before responding, which was to get me to think about it. Teach to fish, not fish for them. But one day, I
right.
needed, I read it urgently, and he responded straight away, and he said, "Damien, I think you should back yourself that you'll make the right decision in the moment." And that's where,
Mm,
um, for me, it's coming back to the people you're talking about. You mentioned someone who's in the music industry, which has a suave character to it, but they're their own person, and that's where I'm just wondering from that
yeah.
perspective. Is that using the Wood character when he's finding his own space? Although it's ironic when you talk about it,
Yeah.
from the fighting perspective. The people that can fight rarely often find themselves in a position where they will fight, or they need to fight. My son's karate
Yeah.
sensei talks about that a lot. There's a certain confidence when you know you can, and I know that from the guys that I was in the SAS with.
Hmm.
Rarely did they get into a fight, if at all.
Yeah. They
Just
knew how to handle the situation prior to all of that
yeah.
happening.
You look at Sun
Right.
Tzu Art of War. One of the first things is you avoid it.
Yeah. And most battles are won before they started.
Yeah,
Right.
it's one of
Yeah. I
those
think,
things. So go ahead.
I think for young men, especially, um, going back to what you were saying about the Duke and
Mm,
is you need to be able to do something with a certain amount of confidence. And
mm,
so I've had a lot of what do you call it, like students who've I've mentored over the years, and a lot of people don't wear a tie anymore,
yeah.
and I would say you don't want to show up to an interview because do you know you can see a man wearing a suit either usually at a wedding, a funeral,
Mm.
or a job interview, and you can tell if that guy has never worn a suit, right?
And it makes a
Can't you
difference.
can't you
Yeah.
tell?
Yeah.
I
Oh,
mean, they
yeah.
just look like, okay, you're at this funeral, you don't want to be at this funeral, and you're
Yeah.
wearing this suit, and someone tied that tie for you. You look completely
Mm,
uncomfortable wearing that. And the tie, it's not necessarily about it being correct or whatever, but you can just see that somebody does not
mm.
feel comfortable in that environment. And I would tell them, like, you don't want to be showing up to a job interview looking like you are completely unprepared because you don't even feel comfortable in what you're wearing.
Yeah.
Put on a
And it
suit,
makes a
put on
difference
the
too
tie,
for
and just walk
people.
around the house.
It's a respect. There's a whole level of respect thing, and there's a number of people that talk about that. Probably most prominently lately is Jordan Peterson. But I look at that. I mean, my
Mm,
14-year-old son, who it's a requirement of their school uniform, that they
mhm,
wear a tie. But what I'm
yeah.
most proud about is that not only can he tie a tie, but he can do a double Windsor.
Oh,
And when you know the difference when you see someone that's gone to that extra effort to make a proper triangle of their tie.
yeah. That is not easy.
Yeah,
And he's
but
only
it's
14.
yeah. So and he can do it. He's done it for a few years now. But then it was like and I showed him when we went through it, and then we had COVID where he didn't have to wear a uniform for a while. We had to relearn it, but he did
Right.
and learned it quickly. And I noticed, and he shines his shoes as well.
Mm.
It
Yeah, and
makes it.
that's the thing with mentorship. If you even have a mentor there and they don't know how to do any of those things,
Mm,
at some point we have to rise to the occasion. I mean, I work from home for a lot now, and I don't
mm,
need to, even when I go into the office, I don't need to get all dressed up, um, if I don't want to. But if I'm at a wedding or a funeral, I mean, I can wear a suit and feel comfortable in that. So I think, yeah, people do need or you go to a nice restaurant and you're wearing a suit. That's that can be very uncomfortable. You're wearing this big bulky suit and you're you're not used to dressing that way, and now you're trying to cut something or whatever, and you can really tell when people are out of their element.
One of the things that does, though, and I know from my experience, because I've always, when I've gone to an interview, I've always wore a suit.
Mm.
It's amazing if you are comfortable in that once you get over that. But because I've always done it, I probably
Mhm.
haven't had that experience of not being comfortable. What I have had the experience of is how much extra confidence it gives you. And I did that with a number of clients as well that were in the construction industry. Even though I'm going to a 22-story skyrise building that's in the middle of construction, so it's dirty, I would wear a full suit.
Mm.
And it was interesting how much more power that gave me in being able to instruct people, to be able to work with people when I was chairing a number of the meetings there. How much more people would listen because of that, but also too how much more confidence it gave me.
Mhm. I
It's
think that's
fascinating.
absolutely right. It's just people can sense how you feel if you exude confidence, and
I had
even
that.
things like just reading a room, and how do you enter a room?
Mm,
And not to call attention to yourself, but how do you enter a room and just figure out what's going on in this room, right? Going
mm,
back to my son had a friend, and he was just kind of off the hook, and he would just, let's say, oh, all the buddies are going to come over, we're all going to watch a movie and have pizza, whatever it was, as 12-year-olds. But he would just burst in the door, blah, blah, like mid sentence, and it's like, one time I told him, I'm like, dude, just chill out, open the door, and just shut your mouth and figure out what the hell's going on in that room.
mm.
Maybe somebody just died. Maybe you don't know what's happening. You just gotta just go in and just read the room and see what is the situation, and how do I fit into this situation appropriately.
I
But
love
he
what you're saying
obviously
there.
didn't
Is
have
not
anyone
only
who had taught him that.
shut your mouth and listen. It's how powerful is that? Anyway, we've talked for a lot longer than we intended to.
Yeah.
If we were to sum it up, what would you want the audience to take away? Obviously, that you've got the book there as well. We'll put the details in the show notes, but where can they find the book? And if you were to wrap it up, what would be the key thing you'd want people to take away from this discussion?
Thank you. It's on Amazon, and one thing that's really meant a lot to me is how many people have texted me, men, women, young, old, and said that they laughed and they cried.
Awesome.
There were parts in the parts of the book that made them cry, and that there was something. The characters are so, or what I've been told is, the characters are developed enough for you to understand and find these connections between the different people. And I think a lot of people would find something in the book that really resonates with them. And I think
Mm.
the last thing I'll say is I've got this kind of ongoing guarantee that if a book club reads the book, the contact me. My contact information is in the book, and I'll do a Zoom call with
Oh,
any
cool.
book club that reads the book and just chat with them wherever they are in
Yeah,
the world.
I love that. Awesome. JP, been wonderful chatting with you. Thank you very much for taking the time. There's so much excitement there. I'd love to do it maybe an Under the Shed.care podcast. We do have a book review, so maybe we could do a book review where we get into a deep dive into the book if you want to do that, although it might be full of spoiler alerts. But I'd love to have a
That's
further
fine.
chat with you in the future.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you for being part of the Share.care community and helping people around the world prosper. You're creating a bigger pie for everyone to share. The more people contributing to the world being a better place, the better the world becomes for others and for you.